Hello, welcome to the 47th episode of the Spiritual Brainstorm. In this episode, we'll be discussing the topic of choice. And this is also linked to free will, of course, the topic of free will. But here I'll just focus on choice. Um, choice is actually the manifestation in our reality, in our 3D reality of free will. That is how we experience free will. If we don't have a choice, then we don't have free will, obviously. But even though this may sound very basic, we've constructed a society and even ideologies that restrict our free will and our choice by default because we are absolutely scared of it. In some spiritual circles, free will is actually known as Satan or the devil. Um, because that is ultimately the energy that allows you to take two paths, for instance, and you have the so called good one and the bad one. Or you can choose God and light, or you can choose darkness. But if you do not have the other path, then you do not have free will, you do not have a choice, you don't have choice, and you do not have experience. Experience also doesn't exist. Experience exists because there is choice and free will. At least that's how I see it. Maybe there is such an experience without free will, but it's very different from what we're experiencing now. That's for sure. So there may be, or let's say that simply speaking, and this refers to some of my older videos, that the collective experience exists thanks to free will, where some parts of reality, because some parts of reality have free will, they serve as a kind of an anchor for all the other elements of reality, which do not necessarily have free will, because they have fully reverse engineered themselves. Like, for instance, you could say that minerals or things like that that are 100% aware of what they are do not necessarily have free will. And their experience, then why doesn't that experience flow infinitely fast? That is because they're beings that do have free will, and that, like us, for instance, to a certain extent, as I'll show later, that slow down the that kind of collective experience. But let's move on. So we are so scared of free will that we're trying to evacuate choice as much as possible. And we've done it in very, very different ways. For instance, one way is monotheist religions. Only one true God and only one correct way of behaving, of believing. And so where does choice enter in that kind of paradigm? If you only have this one true God, all the truth is in the one holy book. That is the word of God. Then how do you account for the existence of free will or choice? There is no choice. It's a non-choice. You have to abide by the monotheist religions, what they say in the book. So you evacuate choice because you're too scared of what you might choose, and thereby you choose on an unconscious level. You leave choice to a higher part of yourself, and you're sort of powerless in making choice, and thereby also free will. One clairvoyant that I really greatly respect says that um, it's the human that has the choice and free will. The animal doesn't. The animal is all unconscious choices based on certain programming, so certain determination. And you'll notice that, for instance, animals in nature, for instance, wild animals, have very little choice or free will, whereas domestic animals, because their souls are being prepared for the human experience, have a much more sophisticated way of behaving, and they start manifesting signs of free will and choice, even though it's more derived from the interaction with their masters than anything else. But still, they're sort of learning. And as far as the human has the choice, but until we are mutant chimps, we still don't have a choice, and we're ruled by unconscious behaviors and things that we have not shed a light on. A second strategy that is more modern of evacuating choice is modern science. Because once you have a objective truth based on facts, a certain methodology, again, where does that leave choice? There is no choice. There is only the right choice, or the true choice. Oops. The right choice. And the wrong choice, of course. So, to vaccinate or not to vaccinate, to wear masks or not to wear masks, um, to use hydroxychloroquine or not. Um, and all of those are based on a certain methodology, of course, the methodology of empirical science, and thereby you don't have a choice. I mean, there is no choice in here. It's just about abiding by what science tells you to do and is true. Now, the reason we're terrified of choice is because choice means taking responsibility. It means that ultimately we are responsible for choosing our reality. Whereas if you say that there is no objective, there is an objective truth, then you are kind of, if there is no choice, then you are kind of a victim of something outside, not of your own choices. It's a sort of an a sort of an um, imposed or forced kind of situation from the outside that you are just suffering and are a victim of. For instance, um, in monotheist religions, of course, you are a victim to um, God's decrees, basically, or whatever God says in the Bible. You didn't choose to write the Bible, you didn't choose what was in the Bible. It is something that came from the outside and enslaves you and commands what you should be doing. The same for science. There is an objective outside truth. Like, for instance, there's this virus that appears. There are plenty of events like natural disasters, and even for instance, a sort of an end of the world or climate change. All of these catastrophes are things that happen to us from the outside, and you're just passively watching. Now, we we do acknowledge to a certain extent that we have an influence on things, but only via the scientific lens. And so it's much easier to not accept or refuse choice and free will and deny the fact that we have it because we're too scared of the responsibility that it brings. We prefer to cling on to a outside truth, an ultimate truth, and believing in an ultimate truth, which is either science or religion, than to say that truth is based on the choice that we consciously make of what we want to experience in the future. Because we don't want the responsibility of it. We don't want to be held responsible for that experience. We want to be able to say, this experience that I'm going through right now, it is something that I didn't choose. It is something that I'm a victim of. That is something that happens to me. It's not something that I chose. And by doing that, you're actually um, forfeiting your choice and feeding it to these sort of entities that exist, like the God of science, for instance, that we've created via our collective consciousness and belief that sort of controls humanity, and indeed forces humanity in a certain extent to experience the end of the world that is inevitably going to happen, since that is the collective belief that we have, and therefore will um, dictate what experience we're going to have in our reality, what's going to manifest. And the latest version of this is, and this is going to hurt, spirituality. The better channelers will tell you about probabilities, potentials, just saying that there are many different futures that exist at any different given moment, and that we have the choice, again, of what we're going to experience. And but the less good ones will tell you about a sort of a spiritual version of the end of the world. And they'll talk about the Cabal, and they'll talk about all kinds of different things, which are not false per se, but are simply the reflection of the choice that unconsciously a certain number of people that have sort of moved on from science to spirituality have made, is that since they consider themselves victims and not empowered and not having free will or choice, and also they don't want the responsibility for what they're creating, then they have to find some system to justify the fact that they will be forced to live through a certain event or a certain probability or a certain potential. And so they forfeit their choice, but they actually unconsciously choose to see things through that lens. And so they again give power to a sort of an artificial god of spirituality that controls their choice for them, and that yeah, that controls humanity, much like the god of science, much like the god of monotheism, which are real mental constructs that have a life of their own in a certain dimension, and control human thought and action because we have not reclaimed our choice. And this shift into 4D or 5D is, well, it's not right around the corner, unfortunately, from more recent understanding. We're heading towards that kind of world, but it it will entail that more and more humans accept that they have a choice, accept that they have free will through the fact that they can make choices, to be clear about what experience they want to live through, and to integrate the fact that they have to choose in order to consciously bring that experience into manifestation, and to accept the responsibility that comes with making those choices and not seeing themselves as victims anymore of an outside truth or reality, and rather understand that there are an infinite number of probabilities and potentials. And the the only way that we're getting to experience those, the ones that we want, is by making a conscious choice. If we don't make a conscious choice, we're making an unconscious choice, and most of the unconscious choices now are the scientific dogma, which is end of the world via climate change, or something else, or economic meltdown and collapse because of the coronavirus, followed by climate change. Either way, um, it's just that we don't accept the responsibility for making a choice, and recognizing that we do have a choice in this end of the world scenario or not. We'd prefer to be told that the end of the world is going to happen. It's 100% certain, and therefore you can sort of lay back and say, okay, if it's the end of the world, then what can I do? And then live on happily ever after. Or that it's 100% certain that we're saved, and therefore you can also like sort of stop worrying. You're like, oh, okay, the spiritual guides said that everything is under control and we're all saved, and therefore I can also live my life without worrying about anything. It's much harder to live in a reality where these potentials and probabilities shift all the time, and you as an individual human, through your choices and your free will, have an influence on those probabilities, and that everything is still up for grabs. Everything, like, it might be the end of the world or it might not, and that we actually do have an influence on the outcome. And that is extremely difficult to integrate. We'd prefer actually to delegate that choice to something above us, because it's just so reassuring. Just like science is so reassuring. And especially what is reassuring is that you can convince everybody else that your choice is the right one, the correct one. Um, Makes you feel less alone, um, makes you reassured in the fact that the end of the world is near. Ah, great, we all agree. And that is not the future. The future is humans reclaiming their choices individually, and then clusters forming of different parts of humanity that might actually split in certain time and experience different realities based on a choice, a real choice. Some of them may be an unconscious one, like, for instance, if some people stick to the scientific dogmatic version of reality, they may experience some climate change disasters in their little corner. and exit this collective experience via that way. And some of them might be more conscious, which is some people that actually reclaim their power and make a conscious choice of what they want to experience, what kind of world they want to experience, what they actually believe in, and recognize that they have a choice, and therefore stop creating entities above them that control them, these gods, artificial gods that you create. Um, so that's it for choice. And in the next episode, I'll be talking about a very interesting experiment that that is linked to this reclaiming the choice, and taking responsibility, and still creating something coherent and global. So see you in the next episode.